Margaret Oliver, former detective constable, is now joining us. She's been at the forefront of exposing or leading a crusade against the park rape gangs in the UK. Ms. Oliver, thank you for joining us on Times Now. I want to begin by asking you, what did you see?
Well, I was a police officer. I was a detective in Greater Manchester Police, and my first experience of what we call grooming gangs or rape gangs was in 2004 and 5. And I was completely shocked at what I saw. I worked on a job for about 18 months. And in that time, we'd identified 97 child rapists, over 3 dozen children. It turns out now it was at almost 70. And my husband was terminally ill. And I went off work to look after him when that job was a major investigation. I came back a couple of months later and the whole job had just been buried. It had been closed. None of those child abusers were charged. No prosecutions. The children not protected. Everything just closed down as though it had never happened. And I was in total shock. I did try to get something done. Nobody wanted to listen. I went back to my normal role, which was working in serious crime on murders, really, not on child protection. And then 5 years later, I was asked to join another case that was identical, became the Rochdale case. And even though I was given cast iron guarantees that there would not be a repeat of what I'd seen previously, once again, I saw that case being mishandled, insufficient charges, victims being failed, people turning away, even a child who was made pregnant when she was just 13, where we had DNA, where we knew who was responsible for her rape. He was a 43-year-old married man of 3. Even that man was charged eventually with conspiracy to commit sexual activity with a child. You could not have had more evidence of rape of a very vulnerable child in a special school. And I spent 18 months as a police officer, going to the chief constable, to the Home Office, to the Children's Commissioner, trying to get someone to listen.
You did everything you could, but nothing changed.
Everything.
We'll talk about the institutional failures of the establishment, in just a bit. But the reason we are having a conversation with you is to you bring to fore the rot of the rape gangs. Many people are still, waking up to the horrors that are mentioned in the report. As a detective constable, what did you see? So someone who does not know how your rape gangs operate, what do they do? How do they do things? What would you tell them?
Well, what they would do on those cases was pick very vulnerable. They would spot vulnerable children. Now, on Augusta, those children lived in children's homes. So the abusers would wait outside in a car, pick the children up, or pick them up from school and then get them drunk, take them in a car. Those children were already vulnerable. That's why they were targeted. For me, the issue is we will never stop child abuse. But the issue with this kind of crime is that the state protective agencies, the police, the prosecution service, social services, deliberately turned away because for me, there were 3 factors. The children were often from difficult backgrounds, so they were not going to be, there was nobody fighting their corner. The second aspect was that the abusers were almost always Pakistani Muslim men, and if they were not Pakistani Muslim men, they might be Afghanistani, but they were still Muslim, Iraqi Muslim from Iran. That was the racial makeup of the abuse. Yeah, the profile. And nobody wanted to be accused of being racist. So they threw the children on the scrap heap. They allowed the abusers to continue to abuse. And the third aspect, that they didn't put the correct resources in. They didn't want to waste money on children that they made a decision didn't matter. I always say, if this had been Boris Johnson's daughter or Keir Starmer's daughter, this would never have happened. It was because the children that were being targeted by the gangs were vulnerable and nobody cared. So instead, those children were criminalized, they were blamed, they were abandoned, their lives were intolerable, and they were completely on their own because nobody was fighting for them. And I resigned from the police because I'm a mum of 4 children, and what I saw went against absolutely everything I believe. Children have to be protected, and as a police officer, my job was to uphold the law. And
I have read about what you've gone through personally. You lost your career, you lost your income,
everything.
You've had a harrowing time yourself, in taking up these cases, speaking up against the system, so to say. Now, let me just break this down for our viewers to understand. I can understand, when politicians fear being tagged racist or Islamophobic because, they have to go fetch votes. But when you approached your seniors in the system, in the police department, are you convinced or, are you of the opinion that they were also under pressure from, the powers that be to play this down, to bury the case?
That, for me, that is irrelevant. I went to the Chief Constable. I went to the Home Office. I gave them all the evidence of what was happening. And the Chief Constable, even though he knew exactly what was going on, they all knew. I was accused of being a woman who became too emotionally involved. I'd lost my husband, so I was basically, losing the plot. I was middle-aged. Those were, they tried to shoot the messenger in me. But by the Chief Constable saying those things, I went through a very traumatic time. It completely changed the rest of my life. I lost my home. I lost my career. I lost my income. I ended up in a little flat with a lodger, with 4 children. It completely derailed my life. But I knew that my children one day, if I'm not here, would put the television on and they would see what had happened. And I wanted them to know that I had tried. So I made the decision that I would go public. But I was threatened with prison. The information I had as a police officer was confidential. But I faced that fear and I decided that wherever it led, I was going to speak the truth. And I've been speaking that for 15 years. So when I see many politicians now, talking about what's gone on, this is not new. What is new is there is now an international spotlight on it. But what's come out in the last few weeks, I've been speaking to people and supporting victims for 15 years. My charity, I set it up, the Margaret Oliver Foundation, who support victims and survivors of all kinds of sexual abuse. We've helped 5,000 since 2019. This is not new for me. But
Ms. Oliver, would you like to tell us about the specific patterns, if any, of how the park rape gangs operate or operated?
In the past, as I say, they would, the rapists would turn up outside school or outside a children's home. Usually a young men would pick the children up. They would target them because of a vulnerability, but then they would take them out for a pizza or give them a bit of jewellery or give them some fun. And these children were starved of affection often. Many of them, on my first job, all of them lived in children's homes. They had no family around them. They had no love. So the men offered that. But then as they befriended them, they would bring in older men, and then it was time to pay back. And, some of the girls have said they've been in a room. One girl in particular, one of the Rochdale girls, said that one white girl would be in the middle of a circle and the men would pass around like a ball. So maybe 20, 30 men would rape that child in one night. They would give her vodka and so much alcohol, and the children would eventually start to use the alcohol as a way to numb the pain. And when they did go to the police would more often than not blamed the child. They were making a lifestyle choice. They were sexually promiscuous. These were 12 and 13-year-old children. And when I saw that and how they were being treated, as I didn't have to be a police officer to know that that was wrong. And I was completely horrified. But that has continued. And still, to this day, none of those senior police officers, or even Home Secretaries, because this went to the top of government. None of them have been held legally or criminally to account. And for me, that is unforgivable. They are responsible for the destruction of so many lives.
You're absolutely right. The enablers, you know, all these people that you're talking about who are part of that, you know, the chain of command must be named, shamed, and the harshest punishment under the law must be handed down so that, you know, a message is sent. Now, Ms. Oliver, tell me something. You know, one can understand patronage, but you know, would it be wrong to say that there were also cases of money exchanging hands? You know, the local, you know, so-called the most influential leader of that community will go to the police and say that, look, you know, these are our men. You take what you want. Let this go.
I am aware of police officers being involved in the abuse. I'm aware of money being exchanged by the children. So on the Rochdale case, for instance, we had a premises that had a long list on the back of the door with all the abusers named. And every time that abuser took a child to that house to rape, there would be a tick. And at the end of the month, that man would pay the man who ran the apartment a certain amount of money, or he would charge money to pass that child round to other abusers. So I'm aware of money being exchanged like that. What I am aware of is that in England we have these groups, or we did on Augusta, called independent advisory groups, and they are meant to work with the police to help keep community cohesion, to stop there being tensions within the community. And I do know that the police were speaking and working with those independent advisory groups, which were of the Pakistani Muslim community, and they were being told, look, we'll deal with it within our community. And so the police were quite happy to just let them go away and deal with it themselves. And of course, it was covered up. And it still continues to be covered up to this day. We still don't see adequate sentencing. They are getting better.
This was nothing to do with community. This is a criminal activity, and the law of the land must have, you know, come into act.
That was always my opinion, and it has not changed to this day. You know, whether somebody, you know, I often say, I mean, in England we've had scandals with like Jimmy Savile, or with there's been Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, and actually there was a lot of abuse in the Catholic Church, particularly in Ireland. For me, a child abuser, wherever he comes from, should have the full weight of the law. So I was able to make this argument with a completely clear conscience. There are good and bad people everywhere, but any man who rapes a young child is bad, and the law is there to be used to prosecute him.
Miss Oliver, you know, when you share this example of this apartment that you were talking about that had on the door a list of abusers or, you know, potential rapists, and every time they would take a girl, they would put a tick mark, and at the end of the month, you know, money exchange hands, etc., etc. That means that all of this was highly organized. You know, it ran like a professional business of exploitation, industrial scale at that.
Absolutely. It was systemic abuse, and it was a very organized network. And we now know, when I was first on that job in 2005, I didn't know this crime existed. I know now that even 10 years before that, it was well known. But the networks built up through family connections. So there might be, I believe Bradford was one of the places that this abuse first started. And then they would have a family member in Rotherham, in Rochdale, in Telford, in the West Midlands. And so the children would be trafficked, so taken in a car from Bradford to Rochdale, where they would be abused in a house there. It was a really sophisticated network. But back 20 years ago, it wasn't as sophisticated as it is now, because this crime has been allowed to
So, Ms. Oliver, are you saying that this is still going on? Nothing has changed?
It's absolutely still going on. I think that the way that children are now groomed has changed, in that often that's now done online. So a child is befriended online, often by somebody who pretends to be their same age. the reality is that when that child goes to meet that person, it can be somebody very much older. And by that time, often there are perhaps naked pictures of that child. The child is then threatened. If you don't do what we want you to do, we will tell your parents, we'll share those pictures with all your school friends. And that child feels trapped. And because the trust in the police and in the system is so broken, that child has nowhere to go. And in fact, I'm aware of cases where a family came to the foundation, to my charity. Their 11-year-old had been groomed online, and the father took the phone off his daughter. She was only 11 at night because it kept on beeping, and it carried on beeping next to his bed. And when he looked, there was all these pictures and all these messages. He went to the police, and the police turned up and told the child that she was guilty of criminal activity in sending those pictures through her phone. But if she deleted everything, that nothing more would be said. That father came to the foundation. Behind that one-man messaging was a gang of about 36 men. So the nature of drawing the children in has often now changed. But what happens when they meet that child is still the same. And until we see proper criminal...
Right, so you're saying they're lured online, and
often.
then befriended, and then
Yes.
they're, drawn out of their...
Threatened.
Yes, threatened and then taken to a place where they are violated, raped. Now,
Yeah.
Miss Oliver, are you aware of cases where, people of the police department or the social service staff was part of this rape gang where they were actually raping the girls?
Yeah. Yes, I am aware of cases like that. And I think that's part of the scandal. And I have got questions in my mind, particularly in relation to one of the cases that I know about, as to whether that case was closed down because of that, because police officers were implicated. So there's still a lot of work to do to bring accountability. That's what now we've got awareness. We have the public are aware of what's happening. The state can no longer pretend it isn't. What we still don't have is accountability for those public servants that have deliberately and knowingly turned away. That's what I want to see, because I believe that that's when we will see change.
Every time, someone, like we are having a conversation and you use the term Pakistani Muslim men several times, every time a survivor or people, like yourself, they mention this phrase, Pakistani Muslim men, eyebrows are raised. And that's part of the problem.
Well, I don't raise my eyebrows because, I've had conversations with hundreds, if not thousands of children who have had their lives destroyed. It's my duty to speak the facts. And my charity is actually taking the government to a judicial review, because we had a 7-year national statutory inquiry where 20 recommendations were made 4 years ago, and they're still sitting on a shelf gathering dust. One of those recommendations, 7,000 victims participated in that. One of those recommendations was that the ethnicity, the religion, the culture of abusers must be recorded, and still that doesn't happen. So it's my duty to say what I know to be the case, and if the facts are gathered, we're not having to tiptoe around it. If the facts are completely different, they're not. But if they were, the facts would show it. But the question has to be asked is, why is there such a reluctance to gather the information, to gather the data?
You're absolutely right. And let me also ask you, Miss Oliver, as someone who's seen this abuse and rape scandal up close, someone who's stood with the survivors. There is now a dispute on the number that this report talks about. The report by Mr. Rupert says the number of survivors is at 250,000, 250,000. Now, there are many independent commentators, etc., so-called activists, whatever you want to call them. They dispute the number. According to you, what do you think is an estimated number of potential victims and survivors?
The reality is that nobody knows, and nobody knows. I've been working in this field now for 20 years. That report that came out has no legal powers. It reflects what I've known for 20 years. A statutory inquiry should act, but unfortunately, the government does not even have to act on recommendations of a statutory inquiry. So, for me, this is about legal...
No, I understand that completely, Miss Oliver, but, if you had to put a number, do you think...
I would be saying hundreds of thousands. That would be my estimate, because, even in one little town, you've got thousands, and that was just in a tiny snapshot of when it's been looked at. These cases have gone back now for 30 years in dozens and dozens, hundreds of areas around the UK. So nobody knows the scale of it. I just know that in my little charity, which I started in 2019, we have helped over 5,000 victims in that time, and they have had to find us. Nobody knows the scale, and we can't undo the damage that's been done. What I want to do is to change things for the future so that other children who are young now do not have to suffer the same neglect, the same life-destroying trauma that the neglect of the state has caused. That is what is horrific about this.
No, you're doing great work. We wish you well. More power to people like you, Miss Oliver. I've gone through the report, and, while the testimonies are disturbing to the core, there is something that I read, where the survivor has narrated that dogs were used, animals were used to rape girls. Can you believe it?
Some of the things that I've seen and heard in 20 years give me nightmares. And that my journey, and this isn't about me, but my journey has been traumatic. But what I always tell myself in the dark moments is that if I can't find the courage to fight on, what chance has one child who has got one voice, who is being criminalized and isolated and terrified and abused? It's my duty as a human being to speak the truth as I know it to be. And that's all I've ever done. So if there's uncomfortable truths there, well, it's tough.
And I'm sure there are many, but, before we end, Miss Oliver, I want you to tell our viewers about some of the most uncomfortable, disturbing aspects that came out of this child sex abuse scandal. I spoke about the testimony where the girl said that dogs were unleashed, etc., to rape girls. What else can you tell us?
I mean, I'm aware, not one of the cases that I've worked on, but not one of the grooming gang cases that I've worked on, but on another case that involved an honour-based situation where a young girl was sent back to Pakistan who had offended the family, and I know from the community and from what happened to her that she was put in a shed in a garden and she was repeatedly raped by the whole community and animals. So I do know that that is a mechanism, like one of the torture mechanisms that I have heard of, but that wasn't a grooming gang case. It was another case that was equally horrific. So it's not something that I haven't heard before. And the reality is that some of the torture that these children have endured, it is brutal and inhumane to the extreme. I just can't comprehend how one human being could do this sort of thing to another. What I just do want to say, though, is that for me, that there are good and bad people everywhere, and there are many people within the Muslim community that are good people. What I want to see is those good people in that community join this conversation.
That's right. Speak up for the victim. Condemn the perpetrators. Yeah. Help the law enforcement agencies. Yes. Get to the perpetrators so that the semblance of justice is seen. I thank you, Miss Oliver, for for all your efforts, for speaking to us, for sharing what you saw. And I just hope that you continue to take up this good fight in the interest of justice. Thank you, Ms. Oliver.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me on. Much appreciated.